In 1940s Hollywood, Joan Bennett Hedy Lamarr and Walter Wanger were locked in the most psychologically perverse love triangle in studio history. When the producer husband began liquidating his blonde wife's career to finance his sexual obsession with a dark, exotic mistress, the wife didn't file for divorce. She executed a hostile takeover. Joan Bennett didn't fight the mistress. She stole her face. She trapped her husband in a sick domestic threesome, weaponizing his visual fetish to hijack his multi-million-dollar studio. It proved the ultimate chilling law of the Golden Age. To survive a Hollywood affair, you don't destroy the mistress. You steal her identity, sleep with the bank, and let the original starve to death in the cold. The standard Hollywood narrative dictates that when a powerful executive husband becomes obsessed with a younger, more exotic rival, the aging wife has two options. She can succumb to a humiliating, highly publicized divorce, surrendering her access to studio capital and fading into social obscurity. Or she can fight a hysterical, emotionally draining domestic battle that ultimately alienates the husband and expedites her own replacement. Joan Bennett rejected both options. She did not weep. She did not hire divorce attorneys to negotiate a severance package. She understood that filing for divorce was an admission of defeat. It was voluntarily stepping off the board. Instead, Joan Bennett executed a precise strike against the foundation of Wanger's obsession. She recognized that he was addicted to the dark, sophisticated European mystery that Hedy Lamarr represented, the exact opposite of Joan's fading American blonde innocence. The turning point came in 1938, while Wanger was unleashing Lamarr's raven-haired exoticism in Algiers. Director Tay Garnett convinced Joan to dye her blonde hair dark for trade winds. What began as a wardrobe adjustment became a career-defining transformation. Recognizing that the era of the innocent blonde was fading, Bennett kept the dark hair. By the time she married Wanger in 1940, she had successfully aligned herself with the emerging mysterious archetype he was actively financing. She wasn't just his wife, she was his ideal leading lady. This physical transformation allowed Bennett to seamlessly step into the lucrative film noir scripts Wanger was developing, projects that were initially envisioned for Lamarr's European mystique. Joan Bennett's ruthlessness was not forged in a vacuum. It was a direct byproduct of the late 1930s studio economy, a machine preparing to liquidate her. Joan did not arrive in Hollywood as a desperate, starving extra. She was born into the Bennett family, a theatrical aristocracy that viewed the entertainment industry not as a magical dreamscape, but as a family business. Her father, Richard Bennett, was a towering figure on the stage. Her sisters, Constance and Barbara, were already established names. Joan understood the mechanics of contract law, leverage, and box office gross from the moment she could walk. She lacked the desperate, feral hunger of women who crawled out of poverty. But she possessed something far more dangerous, a clinical understanding of how quickly the industry replaced assets that failed to turn a profit. Throughout the 1930s, Joan Bennett was a highly efficient revenue generator. She possessed a soft, luminous, natural blonde beauty. The studios packaged her as the quintessential American ingenue. She played the sweet sister, the loyal girlfriend, the upper-class debutante who simply needed to be rescued by a rugged, leading man in a tuxedo. She starred in films like Little Women and countless light, frothy comedies. It was a comfortable, lucrative demographic. But innocence is a rapidly depreciating asset. As the decade drew to a close, Joan approached her 30s. The biological clock in the golden age was unforgiving. Her brand of soft blonde sweetness was beginning to curdle into irrelevance. The public was growing bored. The box office, returns on her films began to stagnate. The major studio executives, men who tracked revenue with the cold precision of morticians, began to view her as a legacy product. The scripts she was offered grew weaker. The leading men assigned to her pictures were no longer A-list superstars, but B-tier contract players. Joan was facing the terrifying reality of professional obsolescence. Her marriage to Walter Wanger in 1940 was, on paper, a brilliant strategic merger. Wanger was not a studio head like Louis B. Mayer or Jack Warner, who were bound by the rigid bureaucracy of corporate boards. Wanger was an independent producer. He raised his own financing, leased the studio space, and maintained complete creative control over his product. He considered himself an intellectual, an artist functioning within a capitalist machine. He was attracted to Joan's pedigree, her class, and her established name. Joan was attracted to his autonomy and his capital. But Walter Wanger suffered from the fatal flaw of the independent warlord, an insatiable ego, and a desperate need to be recognized as a discoverer of raw, exotic talent. He did not just want to produce movies. He wanted to shape culture. He looked down on the factory-line blondes that populated Hollywood. He craved prestige. He craved the European avant-garde. And that craving materialized in the form of a woman who carried an unparalleled aura of scandal and international mystique. Hedy Lamarr was not a traditional Hollywood acquisition. She was a geopolitical event. Born Hedwig Kiesler in Vienna, she had achieved global infamy in 1933 by starring in the Czech film Ecstasy, where she appeared entirely nude and simulated an orgasm on camera. The film was banned in multiple countries, condemned by the Vatican, and instantly transformed her into the most notorious woman on the continent. She was married to Fritz Mandl, a fascist-adjacent Austrian arms dealer who was so fiercely possessive of her that he attempted to purchase and destroy every existing print of Ecstasy. Lamarr lived as a gilded prisoner in his castles, absorbing conversations about munitions and radio guidance systems from generals and dictators. When the political climate became intolerable, she executed a daring escape, fleeing Europe with nothing but the clothes on her back and her devastating weaponized beauty. When Louis B. Mayer met Lamarr on the ocean liner Normandy during her flight to America, he recognized her raw commercial potential, but was terrified of her scandalous reputation. Mayer signed her to MGM, but he immediately attempted to sanitize her. He forced her to change her name to Hedy Lamarr to distance her from the Ecstasy scandal. He wanted to package her as a standard, manageable studio asset. Walter Wanger saw the situation entirely differently. Wanger did not want to sanitize Hedy Lamarr. He wanted to exploit the exact darkness, the severe, aggressive sexuality that terrified Louis B. Mayer. Wanger negotiated a deal to borrow Lamarr from MGM for a film he was independently producing titled Algiers in 1938. The moment Wanger put Hedy Lamarr in front of a camera, the power dynamic of the entire industry shifted. In Algiers, Lamarr did not play the innocent American girl. She played Gabby, a sophisticated, dangerous, incredibly wealthy French woman dripping in jewels. Her jet black hair parted severely down the middle. She spoke with a slow, hypnotic, heavily accented cadence. She possessed a chillingly calm demeanor that completely emasculated the male lead. The film was a massive, seismic hit. It essentially launched the aesthetic prototype for the entire film noir movement. The public was electrified by this new, dark, impenetrable female archetype. Women across America rushed to salons to dye their hair black and part it down the center. Walter Wanger was completely intoxicated by the monster he had helped unleash. He looked at Hedy Lamarr and saw the ultimate cinematic fetish. She was the dark, cynical European future of the industry, and he believed he was the man destined to control it. The fixation became systemic. Wanger began to funnel his massive independent resources toward developing projects specifically tailored for Lamarr's unique, raven-haired aesthetic. He obsessed over lighting techniques to capture the exact, cold reflection in her eyes. He instructed his writers to draft narratives where the central female character was not a victim, but a deadly, manipulative force of nature. He was pouring the capital of his independent production company, the very capital that Joan Bennett relied upon for her own survival, into the cultivation of a rival asset. For Joan Bennett, sitting in her Bel Air mansion, the threat was absolute. Bennett didn't hire private investigators or throw porcelain. She simply looked at her husband's spending habits and recognized a brutal market shift. On one front, the Hollywood market was actively rejecting the blonde, naive persona she had spent 10 years building. On the other front, her husband, the man whose capital and influence she needed to re-engineer her career, was liquidating his attention and resources to fund the exact dark-haired, dangerous archetype that the market now demanded. Joan saw the trajectory with terrifying clarity. If Wanger continued to obsess over Lamarr, he would eventually cast her in every prestige project he financed. Joan would be relegated to the position of the neglected aging wife, receiving the scraps of his production slate, or worse, forced out entirely. Hedy Lamarr was not just a threat to Joan's domestic peace. She was an apex predator, actively consuming Joan's professional food supply. In the brutal economy of the 1940s studio system, a woman could not compete against a newer model by complaining. She could not win a turf war by demanding loyalty. Loyalty in Hollywood is a myth sold to the press. The only way to survive a hostile takeover is to execute a countermeasure so severe, so psychologically disruptive, that it completely short-circuits the opponent's strategy. Joan Bennett understood that her husband was not a man who could be reasoned with. He was a man driven by visual stimulation. He was chasing an image. He was chasing the shadows, the black hair, the severe, unapologetic danger of the femme fatale. Bennett recognized the shifting market and Wanger's visual preferences. She fully embraced the dark, cynical persona required for the emerging film noir genre. This transformation neutralized the need for an external muse. She successfully merged her legal status as his wife with the specific aesthetic he wanted to put on screen. The architecture of female survival in the golden age of Hollywood was built entirely on visual semiotics. In the studio system, hair color was not a genetic trait. It was a demographic target. It was a corporate branding strategy dictating exactly how a woman was to be consumed by the American public. For a decade, Joan Bennett was locked inside the prison of the Hollywood blonde. In the economic reality of the 1930s, the blonde was the ultimate symbol of passive, accessible innocence. The blonde was the victim. She was the woman tied to the train tracks, the loyal secretary, the upper-class debutante who required the physical intervention of a male protagonist to secure her future. The studios mass-produced this archetype because it was safe. It comforted the patriarchal hierarchy of the Depression era. But as the 1940s approached, the global psychology darkened, and the market value of the blonde plummeted. The era of the film noir required a new apex predator. It required the brunette. The dark-haired woman in the 1940s cinematic landscape was not a victim. She was a threat. She represented the exotic, the dangerous, the sexually autonomous female who did not wait for rescue. She orchestrated the ruin of the men around her. Hedy Lamarr was the absolute, uncontested pioneer of this new, highly lucrative aesthetic. With her severe jet-black center part, her heavy-lidded gaze, and her European aloofness, Lamarr shattered the industry's reliance on fading pastel ingenues. Walter Wanger, Joan Bennett's husband and one of the most ruthless independent producers in Hollywood, was completely hypnotized by this new visual currency. He looked at Hedy Lamarr and saw the future of the box office. More dangerously, he saw his own personal fetish realized on 35mm film. He was pouring his independent financing, his creative energy, and his psychological obsession into cultivating Lamarr. Joan Bennett, sitting in the fading light of her own blonde obsolescence, recognized the fatal geometry of the situation. Most women in her position would have initiated a domestic war. They would have hired private investigators. They would have confronted their husbands in screaming, tearful, porcelain-smashing arguments that would inevitably leak to the gossip columnists of Photoplay or Luella Parsons. They would have forced the producer to choose between the comfortable, aging wife and the exotic, mysterious mistress. Joan Bennett knew that forcing a powerful man to choose is a tactical error. When you force a dictator to choose, he will invariably choose the novelty over the routine. He will choose the fantasy over the domestic reality. If Joan filed for divorce, she would not just lose a husband. She would lose her primary access to production capital. She would be instantly downgraded from a producer's wife to an aging freelance blonde in a market that no longer bought blondes. She would be financially and professionally liquidated. Joan refused to be cast aside. She recognized that Walter Wanger was not engaging in a profound emotional romance with Hedy Lamarr. Wanger was a visual addict. He was obsessed with an aesthetic configuration. He was chasing a specific combination of shadows, sharp cheekbones, and raven hair. Therefore, the solution was not to attack the man. The solution was to hack the aesthetic. But Joan Bennett was a creature of the theater. She knew that hair color alone was not enough to complete a psychological replication. The transformation had to be total. The avatar had to be flawless. She altered the geometry of her face. She stopped plucking her eyebrows into the soft, surprised arches of the 1930s. She allowed them to grow in, penciling them into severe, aggressive straight lines that mirrored Lamarr's predatory European gaze. She changed her makeup palette entirely. The pinks and peaches of the sweet American girl were discarded. She adopted a heavy pale matte foundation, starkly contrasting with dark, blood-red lipstick. She trained her eyes to drop, adopting the heavy-lidded, cynical stare that Lamarr had weaponized in Algiers. She overhauled her wardrobe. The soft, flowing, floral fabrics of her past were burned. She commissioned sharp, tailored, highly structured suits with broad shoulder pads. She dressed not like a woman waiting for a man, but like a woman preparing for a board meeting. She lowered the register of her voice, stripping away the eager, high-pitched chatter of the blonde, replacing it with a slow, deliberate, throaty cadence. With this new, severe aesthetic, Bennett effectively mirrored the cinematic essence of Lamarr, positioning herself as the perfect, readily available alternative for Wanger's dark new productions. She had not accused him of infidelity. She had not demanded a divorce. She had simply absorbed the object of his infidelity. Wanger was a man who trafficked in images, and Joan had just presented him with the ultimate optical illusion. She had unified the safety, the legality, and the financial stability of his marriage with the dark, illicit thrill of his obsession. The genius of Joan's strategy lay in its ruthless efficiency. She attacked the supply chain. Why would Walter Wanger exert the immense political and financial effort required to borrow Hedy Lamarr from the oppressive contracts of Louis B. Mayer at MGM? Why would he navigate the scandalous public relations nightmare of an affair? Why would he chase the European import when he now owned the exact same aesthetic, legally bound to him by a marriage certificate sitting in his own living room? Joan Bennett made Hedy Lamarr redundant. She proved that in the mass production machinery of Hollywood, authenticity is entirely irrelevant. Hedy Lamarr may have been born with the raven hair and the European mystique, but Joan Bennett proved that the mystique could be reverse engineered, manufactured, and deployed with far greater strategic precision. Joan weaponized the very nature of the studio system, a system that treated women as interchangeable parts, against the woman who threatened her empire. Wanger was trapped in a feedback loop of his own desires. He was mesmerized by this synthetic wife-as-mistress hybrid. The obsession that had been leaking out of the marriage was instantly, violently redirected inward. The producer looked at his wife and no longer saw a depreciating asset. He saw his muse. He saw the ultimate leading lady for the dark, cynical era of cinema he was trying to build. The psychological warfare was complete. Joan had secured the perimeter, but surviving the marriage was only the first phase of the operation. Now that she had successfully hijacked her husband's attention, she needed to hijack his capital. The physical transformation was the key that unlocked the vault. Joan Bennett did not just want to keep her husband in her bed. She wanted to keep his production budgets in her bank account. She knew that Wanger had been hoarding a specific type of script. He had been quietly acquiring the rights to dark, violent, highly psychological crime novels, the foundational texts of what would soon be universally recognized as film noir. These were scripts populated by ruthless, manipulative, brilliant women, scripts that were explicitly, undeniably earmarked for Hedy Lamarr. Joan Bennett, armed with her new, severe, raven-haired identity, stepped into Wanger's office. She did not ask for a role in these new productions. She did not politely request a screen test. She demanded the empire. She used her newly minted status as his visual obsession to systematically strip every prime narrative asset away from her rival. She positioned herself as the only logical, financially sound choice to lead his new, dark cinematic universe. She was telling him, without ever having to say the words, "You built this aesthetic for her, but I perfected it. and I am already on the payroll. The transfer of wealth and power was about to begin. The innocent blonde had been successfully assassinated. The femme fatale had seized the throne. And out in the cold, the woman the world deemed the most beautiful in existence was about to realize that raw organic beauty is completely defenseless against a woman who understands how to manipulate the machinery of the corporation. The domestic ambush was only the first phase of the operation. Joan Bennett had successfully hacked the visual circuitry of her husband's obsession, neutralizing the immediate threat of Hedy Lamarr within the confines of their Bel Air estate. But securing the marriage was a defensive maneuver. In the brutal expansionist economy of 1940s Hollywood, defense does not generate capital. You either expand your market share or you are liquidated. With the domestic trap sprung and Wanger's visual fetish localized in his own home, Bennett moved immediately to the executive suites. She hadn't dyed her hair just to secure her marriage. She did it to seize his production slate. Wanger was fundamentally an independent warlord. He did not possess the endless automated assembly line of Louis B. Mayer or Jack Warner. Every dollar Wanger spent was his own, or raised through his specific, meticulously cultivated network of financiers. He operated on narrow margins and high-stakes gambles. For months, Wanger had been hoarding a highly specific type of narrative capital. He was acquiring the rights to dark, violent, psychologically complex crime novels. These were the foundational blueprints of film noir. They were scripts that required a female lead who was not a victim, but an apex predator, a woman whose beauty was a lethal calculating instrument designed to ruin men. These scripts were explicitly, undeniably earmarked for the European mystique of Hedy Lamarr. Wanger had envisioned a cinematic universe built entirely around Lamarr's raven-haired, cynical aesthetic. Joan Bennett walked into Wanger's production office and initiated a strategic pivot of that entire cinematic universe. She did not utilize tears. She did not utilize romantic persuasion. She utilized the cold, irrefutable logic of corporate economics. Joan understood the immense financial friction involved in working with Hedy Lamarr. Lamarr was not a free agent. She was the legal property of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. To cast Lamarr in an independent production, Wanger had to negotiate a loan-out agreement with Louis B. Mayer. Mayer despised Wanger's independence and routinely punished him by demanding exorbitant, extortionate loan-out fees for his stars. Furthermore, Lamarr was notoriously demanding, unpredictable on set, and carried the heavy, expensive baggage of her international scandals. She was a high-risk, high-cost asset. Bennett presented Wanger with a logical, financially sound alternative. She offered Wanger a flawless corporate alternative. She was already on the payroll. She required zero loan-out fees to a rival studio. She possessed a decade of disciplined set experience. She was a highly professional, available asset who now, through a complete aesthetic overhaul, possessed the exact dark, exotic visual identity that Wanger was obsessed with. She looked at her husband and presented the ultimate capitalist proposition. Why pay a premium to lease a defective, expensive product from an enemy corporation when you own the upgraded, identical model free and clear? Walter Wanger, a man who worshipped efficiency almost as much as he worshipped beauty, recognized the undeniable brilliance of the pitch. He was trapped by the financial logic. Joan had not just stolen Hedy Lamarr's face, she had fundamentally undercut Lamarr's market value. Wanger agreed to pivot the production slate. The scripts that had been secretly tailored for the Austrian immigrant were systematically transferred to the desk of the American wife. But to legitimize this aesthetic theft, Wanger needed an architect who could translate Joan's new persona into cinematic reality. He needed a director who understood darkness. He hired Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang was an Austrian exile, a master of German expressionism, and a man whose worldview was shaped by the brutal, paranoid collapse of Europe. Lang did not make movies about happy endings. He made movies about the inescapable, crushing weight of human depravity. When Wanger introduced Lang to Joan Bennett, the director did not see the fading blonde ingenue of the 1930s. He saw the cold, calculated, engineered brunette. He saw a woman who had willingly destroyed her own identity to seize power. Lang recognized a fellow cynic. This unholy trinity, Wanger's money, Lang's direction, and Bennett's stolen aesthetic, mobilized to produce a film that would serve as Joan's declaration of absolute supremacy, The Woman in the Window. Released in 1944, the film was a structural masterpiece of psychological terror. Joan Bennett played Alice Reed, a mysterious dark-haired woman whose mere portrait in a storefront window triggers the complete moral and physical destruction of a respected middle-aged professor. When the cameras rolled, Bennett fully utilized her new persona, trading her blonde eagerness for cold, calculated control. She stripped away every ounce of the eager, high-pitched, people-pleasing energy that had defined her blonde era. She moved with a slow, deliberate, heavy-lidded lethargy. She spoke in a low, flat, emotionless register. She projected an aura of absolute, terrifying calm, while the men around her panicked, sweated, and murdered for her. She was channeling the exact specific European aloofness of Hedy Lamarr, but she was delivering it with the ruthless American efficiency of a woman who knew her survival depended on the box office returns. The public response was explosive. Audiences who had grown bored with the sweet Joan Bennett were electrified by this dark, lethal, sophisticated predator. The Woman in the Window was a massive, unprecedented commercial and critical success. With the box office receipts pouring in, Joan Bennett validated her power shift with hard capital. She proved to Wanger, to Fritz Lang, and to the entire studio system that she was not just a substitute for Hedy Lamarr. She was a highly optimized, financially superior upgrade. She had taken Lamarr's raw, organic aesthetic and weaponized it into a reliable mass-market commodity. The immediate follow-up, Scarlet Street, in 1945, was an even more brutal assertion of dominance. Again directed by Fritz Lang and financed by Wanger, Joan played Kitty, a street-smart, deeply cynical woman who systematically exploits, humiliates, and destroys an aging, naive artist. The meta-narrative of Scarlet Street was staggering. On screen, Joan Bennett was playing a woman of pure, unadulterated exploitation, a woman who uses a man solely for his financial resources and artistic output, completely indifferent to his suffering. She was playing out the ultimate destruction of the male ego, and she was doing it in a film financed by her own husband, using the exact visual identity she had stolen to manipulate his psychological weaknesses. Joan was essentially broadcasting her entire marital and corporate strategy to theaters across the globe, and getting paid millions of dollars to do it. While Joan Bennett was busy establishing herself as the undisputed sovereign queen of film noir, the reality for the woman whose identity she had stolen was rapidly deteriorating into a nightmare of corporate suffocation. Hedy Lamarr was trapped in the gilded cage of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. She was stranded behind the enemy lines of Louis B. Mayer's empire. Mayer had never understood her dark, aggressive sexuality. He found her European mystique threatening to the wholesome, family-oriented brand of his studio. He actively suppressed the very qualities that made her famous in Algiers. Mayer forced Lamarr into a series of sanitized, highly restrictive, and utterly mediocre productions. He cast her as decorative set dressing in films like White Cargo and Tortilla Flat. He demanded she lighten her makeup, soften her expressions, and attempt to play standard, unthreatening romantic leads. He was actively attempting to bleach the danger out of her. Hedy Lamarr was suffocating on the MGM lot. She knew that her unique market value lay in the shadows, not in the bright, cheerful lighting of Louis B. Mayer's musicals. She desperately needed an escape hatch. She needed an independent producer who understood her aesthetic, a producer who possessed the capital and the vision to build dark, sophisticated narratives around her European mystery. She needed Walter Wanger. For months, she had been waiting for the call. She had been waiting for the independent rescue ship that Wanger had promised when they collaborated on Algiers. She knew Wanger was acquiring the crime novels. She knew the film noir movement was gathering momentum, and she knew she was the absolute uncontested pioneer of that entire cinematic language. It was her intellectual property, but the call never came. Instead of receiving a script, Hedy Lamarr received the Hollywood trade papers. She opened the daily publications and read the production announcements. Walter Wanger's independent company was launching a massive slate of dark, psychological thrillers. Fritz Lang was directing, and the star of every single one of these projects, the woman occupying the exact roles, wearing the exact clothes, and projecting the exact raven-haired aesthetic that belonged to Lamarr, was Joan Bennett. The psychological devastation of that realization was absolute. Hedy Lamarr did not just lose a role. She watched another woman steal her face, her genre, and her primary financial backer, all in one synchronized, surgical strike. Lamarr realized that she had been outmaneuvered not by superior beauty, but by superior corporate leverage. Joan Bennett did not have to negotiate with Louis B. Mayer. Joan Bennett slept next to the bank. Lamarr was a foreign asset dealing with the brutal, xenophobic bureaucracy of the studio system. Joan Bennett was a Hollywood aristocrat utilizing her marital contract to secure a monopoly on the independent production sector. The supply chain of Hedy Lamarr's career had been completely severed. Wanger's obsession, the very fuel that was supposed to launch her into the stratosphere of independent cinema, had been successfully intercepted, diverted, and absorbed by his wife. Hedy was left isolated on the MGM lot, a magnificent, dangerous weapon sitting in a warehouse, slowly rusting under the supervision of executives who had no idea how to fire her. Joan Bennett's execution of this identity theft proved a terrifying law of the Golden Age factory floor. In a system built on mass production, being the original is entirely meaningless. The market does not reward authenticity. The market rewards the entity that controls the distribution network. Hedy Lamarr was the authentic, organic femme fatale. But Joan Bennett controlled the producer, the director, and the financing. Joan did not need to be authentic. She simply needed to be identical, available, and ruthless enough to lock the original out of the building. And as the 1940s bled into a new decade, the consequences of this brutal resource starvation would send one woman into permanent, undisputed cinematic royalty, while the other would be slowly, methodically erased by the very machine that had once declared her the most beautiful woman in the world. In the predatory ecosystem of the Golden Age studio system, winning a territorial dispute is never sufficient. To secure a permanent monopoly, the opponent must not merely be defeated, they must be entirely liquidated. Joan Bennett had successfully weaponized her husband's visual fetish, securing both her domestic standing and the capital of his independent production company. But the final phase of this corporate warfare required the systematic starvation of the original asset. Hedy Lamarr was not going to be fired. Hollywood rarely fires its most famous faces. It simply cuts off their oxygen supply and waits for them to suffocate. The agonizing suffocation of Hedy Lamarr in the mid-1940s was built directly into the architecture of her contract at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of the studio, fundamentally misunderstood the asset he had purchased. Mayer was a man who built an empire on sentimental Americana. He traded in tap-dancing children, singing families, and wholesome, brightly lit moral victories. He looked at Hedy Lamarr, a woman whose very presence radiated dark European cynicism and lethal aggressive sexuality, and he was terrified. Mayer viewed Lamarr's notorious past in the scandalous European film Ecstasy, not as a marketing tool, but as a corporate liability. He spent years attempting to sanitize her. He forced her into heavily censored, visually flat productions. He draped her in absurd exotic costumes in films like White Cargo, reducing her from a sophisticated, dangerous femme fatale into a campy, two-dimensional caricature. He was actively bleaching the danger out of her brand. Lamarr knew she was depreciating. She understood that her true market value lay in the shadows, in the emerging cynical genre of film noir. Algiers had proven that. She possessed the intellectual capacity to recognize the cultural shift. She was historically a brilliant, mathematically gifted inventor who had literally co-patented a frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology for Allied torpedoes during the World War II. She possessed a mind engineered for complex systems, but in Culver City, her mind was irrelevant. To the studio executives, she was merely a piece of visual real estate, and Mayer was mismanaging the property. She needed an extraction. She needed an independent producer who operated outside the sanitized walls of MGM, someone who possessed the vision and the capital to build a dark, psychological cinematic universe around her specific aesthetic. She needed Walter Wanger, but Wanger's capital had already been seized. When Hedy Lamarr opened the Hollywood trade papers, she did not see salvation. She saw her own visual identity being mass-produced by a rival corporation. She watched as Joan Bennett, utilizing a stolen raven-haired aesthetic, dominated the box office in The Woman in the Window and Scarlet Street. Joan was occupying the exact narrative space, speaking the exact cynical dialogue, and being photographed by the exact expressionist directors that should have belonged to Lamarr. Bennett successfully occupied the cinematic space that Lamarr had helped create. While Lamarr struggled against the rigid management of MGM, Bennett utilized her proximity to Wanger's independent financing. She dominated the emerging film noir genre, capitalizing on the exact dark, cynical roles that perfectly suited Lamarr's established persona. Lamarr, a brilliant mind who had literally co-patented torpedo technology for the Allies, was now reduced to scanning the Hollywood trade papers in disbelief. She watched another woman wear her tailored suits, speak her cynical lines, and monopolize her entire genre, while MGM executives forced the original inventor into sanitized, brightly lit musicals. Driven by the desperation of a cornered asset, Lamarr made a fatal corporate miscalculation. In 1945, she refused to renew her contract with Louis B. Mayer. She walked away from the massive, protective, and highly lucrative infrastructure of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. She believed that her face alone was enough capital to sustain an independent production company. She believed she could become her own Walter Wanger. She formed Mars Film Corporation. She attempted to produce her own starring vehicles, films like The Strange Woman and Dishonored Lady. She attempted to reclaim the dark, complex, psychological roles that Joan Bennett had monopolized. But Hollywood is not a meritocracy of beauty. It is a cartel. Hedy Lamarr possessed the face, but she lacked the ruthless, street-level executive infrastructure. She did not have a Walter Wanger to aggressively negotiate distribution deals. She did not have a Fritz Lang to elevate the material from cheap melodrama to high art. She was surrounded by sycophants, bad managers, and parasitic investors who drained her capital. Producing a motion picture requires a level of cutthroat bureaucratic sadism that Lamarr, despite her brilliance, was entirely unequipped to deploy. Her independent ventures failed to gain absolute market traction. They were logistical nightmares plagued by budget overruns and distributor interference. The studio cartel closed ranks against her. Without the protective muscle of a major studio or a heavyweight independent warlord behind her, Lamarr was exposed to the brutal, unforgiving elements of the free market. While Hedy Lamarr was bleeding capital in a desperate bid for autonomy, Joan Bennett was institutionalizing her stolen identity. Joan did not just sit back and act in her husband's films. She solidified her hostile takeover by legally binding herself to the means of production. In 1945, Joan Bennett, Walter Wanger, and director Fritz Lang officially incorporated their own independent production company. They named it Diana Productions. This was the ultimate consolidation of power. Joan was no longer merely a contracted actress sleeping with the producer. She was a corporate officer. She was the vice president of Diana Productions. She owned a percentage of the negative. She had a seat at the boardroom table. She had successfully transitioned from a heavily managed, depreciating blonde asset into a raven-haired executive who owned her own distribution pipeline. Through Diana Productions, Joan Bennett starred in a relentless succession of film noir classics. She delivered Secret Beyond the Door and The Reckless Moment. She perfected the archetype of the hardened, deeply cynical American woman navigating a corrupt, violent world. She did not possess Hedy Lamarr's organic, breathtaking European beauty, but she possessed something far more lethal: corporate leverage. Joan understood that on the factory floor, efficiency and distribution will always defeat pure aesthetics. The contrast between the two women by the end of the 1940s was a stark, brutal testament to the mechanics of survival in the studio system. Joan Bennett, the synthetic brunette, was sitting at the absolute apex of her power, generating millions of dollars, controlling her own narratives, and ruling the independent sector of Hollywood with an iron fist. She had weaponized her marriage, hacked her husband's psychology, and built an empire on the ruins of her blonde past. Hedy Lamarr, the organic brunette, was suffocating. The independent gamble had broken her financial back. The industry, having successfully extracted and replicated her aesthetic through women like Joan Bennett, no longer had any use for the expensive, difficult, and unprotected original. The studios stopped calling. The scripts stopped arriving. The descent was not a rapid plunge, but a slow, agonizing public erasure. Cecil B. DeMille cast her in Samson and Delilah in 1949, which was a massive financial hit, but it was a spectacle, not a psychological drama. It required her to be a silent, beautiful statue, entirely stripped of the complex, dangerous agency she had pioneered in Algiers. It was the final lucrative exploitation of her face before the machine discarded her completely. Joan Bennett survived. She survived the collapse of the studio system. She survived the changing demographics. When the film noir era ended, she did not panic. She simply mutated again. She transitioned to television, starring in the gothic soap opera Dark Shadows, securing a steady, lucrative paycheck for another decade. She survived because she never believed the lie that Hollywood sold to the public. She never believed that beauty or talent guaranteed safety. She knew that safety was a myth, and that survival belonged exclusively to the ruthless. The legacy of the Wanger-Bennett Lamarr triangle is a clinical autopsy of the Hollywood power structure. It proves that the femme fatale was not just a character on a movie screen. It was a required corporate strategy. Bennett outmaneuvered the changing industry, while Lamarr struggled against the constraints of the studio system. Bennett secured her own survival by adapting her image and anchoring her husband's production company. She proved that in the brutal economy of Hollywood, longevity belonged to those who understood leverage and adaptability. In the cinematic universe of the 1940s, the femme fatale does not simply walk away after the credits roll. When a woman surgically alters her identity to inhabit a genre defined by paranoia, violence, and betrayal, that genre inevitably bleeds into her reality. Joan Bennett had successfully secured her empire. She controlled Diana Productions, and she controlled her marriage. But the fundamental law of the Hollywood studio system dictates that power is a zero-sum game. For Joan Bennett's leverage to increase, Walter Wanger's leverage had to contract. And as the Golden Age entered its twilight in the late 1940s, the independent warlord who had financed her calculated maneuver began to rapidly, catastrophically hemorrhage capital. Walter Wanger's financial instincts, once razor-sharp, dulled. He was a man who believed his own mythology. He attempted to pivot away from the highly profitable, low-budget film noir thrillers that Joan had monopolized, aiming instead for massive, prestige-driven historical epics. He poured millions of dollars of independent financing into the 1948 production of Joan of Arc, starring Ingrid Bergman. The film was a bloated logistical nightmare. It was a colossal box office failure, further exacerbated by the scandalous revelation of Bergman's extramarital affair with director Roberto Rossellini, which triggered a massive public boycott. Wanger's independent empire, The very machinery that Joan Bennett had fought so ruthlessly to commandeer was facing total bankruptcy. Banks refused to extend his lines of credit. Studio executives who once feared his autonomy now openly mocked his financial desperation. Wanger was no longer the apex predator of the independent sector. He was bleeding in the water, and the sharks were circling. As Wanger's corporate power disintegrated, his psychological grip on his marriage tightened into a suffocating, paranoid vice. He had built Joan Bennett's dark, seductive persona. He had financed the lighting, the directors, and the wardrobe that transformed her into the ultimate object of desire. But when a man constructs a weaponized asset, he lives in perpetual terror that the weapon will be turned against him. Wanger looked at his wife, the synthetic femme fatale he had helped manufacture, and he no longer saw a loyal corporate partner. He saw a flight risk. Joan was still generating revenue. Her brand was still viable. She was the only valuable asset he had left. That flight risk required new management. Jennings Lang was not an aging, failing independent producer. He was a high-powered, razor-sharp talent agent at the Music Corporation of America. MCA was known in the industry as the Octopus. They were the ruthlessly efficient, suit-and-tie corporate monolith that was systematically taking over Hollywood as the old studio system collapsed. They represented the future of entertainment capital. As Wanger's production company imploded, Joan Bennett executed a standard pragmatic business maneuver. She sought new solvent management. She signed with MCA, and Jennings Lang became her personal representative. He was tasked with securing her future, negotiating television contracts and theater tours as her husband's film financing dried up. To Walter Wanger, this was not a business transaction. It was a hostile extraction. Wanger was a man who viewed his wife not as an autonomous human being, but as proprietary intellectual property. Jennings Lang was not just an agent, he was a corporate raider, attempting to poach Wanger's most valuable remaining asset. The frequent meetings, the private lunches, the hushed conversations between Joan and her agent, standard industry practices for a star navigating a career transition, were filtered through Wanger's deteriorating bankrupt psychology as irrefutable evidence of a physical and corporate betrayal. Wanger believed Lang was sleeping with his wife, but more importantly, he believed Lang was stealing his property. The meticulously controlled, highly profitable film noir universe that Joan Bennett had engineered finally breached the containment vessel of the silver screen. On the afternoon of December 13th, 1951, Walter Wanger's professional anxiety and personal paranoia culminated in sudden violence. Suspecting a romantic affair between his wife and her agent, Jennings Lang, Wanger confronted them in the MCA parking lot in Beverly Hills. Armed with a .38 caliber revolver, the producer fired twice, injuring the agent, while the press quickly sensationalized the event as a dramatic love triangle. It marked the tragic breaking point of a man whose independent empire and personal life were simultaneously unraveling. Lang survived the shooting, but the Hollywood establishment was instantly paralyzed. The gunfire in the MCA parking lot was the most explosive, grotesque scandal of the decade. It ripped away the civilized, aristocratic veneer of the Wanger-Bennett marriage and exposed it to the global press as a toxic, possessive, paranoid nightmare. The studio system, with its rigid morality clauses and its absolute terror of public backlash, demanded blood. The unwritten rule of the Golden Age was absolute. When a scandal of this magnitude detonated, the female asset was to be immediately discarded. The press, the studio executives, and the American public expected Joan Bennett to be destroyed. They expected her to dissolve into a weeping, hysterical victim, permanently exiled from the industry for driving her husband to attempted murder. They fundamentally misunderstood the psychological architecture of Joan Bennett. She was not a victim. She was the woman who had cold-bloodedly assassinated her own blonde identity to seize control of a production company. She was a survivor of the factory floor, and she possessed an immunity to shame that only a woman raised in the ruthless, transactional economy of Hollywood could cultivate. Joan Bennett did not panic. She executed a masterclass in crisis management. She did not flee Los Angeles. She did not issue tearful apologies to the press for her husband's actions. She did not beg the public for forgiveness. Instead, she deployed the exact same cold, aristocratic, impenetrable demeanor she had perfected under the direction of Fritz Lang. She treated the attempted murder not as a passionate, romantic tragedy, but as a regrettable, messy logistical error committed by a failing executive. When the police arrived at the scene, Joan was reportedly calm, demanding that the officers treat her with the respect owed to her status. In the ensuing media circus, she maintained an icy silence. She refused to validate the narrative that she was a homewrecker or a femme fatale come to life. She simply absorbed the shock wave and waited for the news cycle to burn itself out. The gunshot in the MCA parking lot did not kill Jennings Lang. It killed Walter Wanger's credit rating. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the Hollywood studio system, violence is only tolerated when it occurs on screen and generates a profit. When violence spills onto the asphalt of a talent agency, it becomes a liability. The moment Walter Wanger pulled the trigger of that .38 caliber revolver, he did not assert his dominance as a husband. He committed corporate suicide. The industry immediately quarantined him. A producer whose psychological stability is so compromised that he attempts a daylight assassination over a contract dispute is a producer who cannot be insured. Banks instantly froze his credit lines. Investors pulled their capital. The independent production empire that he had spent 2 decades building, the very empire that Joan Bennett had ruthlessly hijacked by altering her hair color and hijacking Hedy Lamarr's aesthetic, evaporated overnight. Wanger was convicted and sent to the Wayside Honor Rancho, a minimum security prison farm. The intellectual warlord of Hollywood was reduced to wearing a denim uniform, stripped of his telephones, his secretaries, and his absolute authority. Joan Bennett's reaction to her husband's incarceration is the ultimate masterclass in damage control and asset preservation. She did not file for divorce immediately. In the highly moralistic, heavily censored culture of the 1950s, abandoning a husband while he was in a prison cell would have cast her as the villain. It would have validated the public's suspicion that she was, in fact, the manipulative femme fatale she played on screen. Joan knew that optics dictated survival. She played the role of the stoic, supportive wife. She visited Wanger in prison. She smiled for the cameras. She maintained the illusion of domestic solidarity. But behind the locked doors of her estate, she was systematically uncoupling her financial future from his sinking ship. When Wanger was released from prison, he was a ghost. He was permitted to produce a few more films, most notably Invasion of the Body Snatchers and the disastrous, bankrupting epic Cleopatra, but he was operating as a hired hand, a broken executive navigating a radically changed industry. He no longer possessed the autonomy to build empires or launch stars. He was obsolete. Joan Bennett waited with terrifying predatory patience. She stayed married to Wanger for 14 more years, extracting the remaining cultural capital from the union, waiting for the scandal to entirely dissipate from the public memory. In 1965, when her own financial independence was absolutely secured, and Wanger was fully marginalized, she filed the divorce papers. She executed the separation with cold, administrative efficiency. The marriage that had survived infidelity, corporate espionage, and a parking lot shootout was finally dissolved by a judge, cleanly severing Joan from a depreciated asset. Joan Bennett did not fade into the obscurity that consumes most aging actresses. She understood that the silver screen was no longer a viable territory for a woman past 50. The major studios were collapsing, and the remaining executives were obsessed with the youth culture of the 1960s. Joan did not waste her time begging for supporting roles in motion pictures. She pivoted to a new, highly lucrative and entirely stable distribution model, daytime television. In 1966, Joan Bennett accepted the role of Elizabeth Collins Stoddard on the Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows. This was not a demotion, it was a brilliant strategic retirement plan. Dark Shadows was a massive, unprecedented cultural phenomenon, a daily broadcast of vampires, ghosts, and familial betrayal. Joan Bennett became the undisputed matriarch of this Gothic universe. She leveraged her decades of film noir experience, her stolen raven-haired mystique, and her aristocratic bearing to anchor the show. She shot over 300 episodes. She secured a massive, steady, entirely predictable income stream. She monetized her own aging process, transforming herself from a lethal seductress into an intimidating, wealthy matriarch. Hedy Lamarr's independent ventures ultimately failed without studio backing, leading to isolation until her death in 2000. Walter Wanger passed away in 1968, his career never fully recovering from the shooting scandal. Joan Bennett, however, outlived both her rival and the husband who betrayed her, passing away peacefully in 1990.